Good afternoon, and a very warm welcome to this EU democracy reform conversation, the latest in a series of online events organised by the EU Democracy Reform Observatory, a joint initiative of the Bertelsmann Stiftung, the European Policy Centre, the King Baudouin Foundation and Stiftung Mercator, to foster the debate on modernising European democracy in the wake of the Conference on the Future of Europe and against the backdrop of the myriad challenges that the EU is facing now, particularly in the context of the Zeitenwende, as it has been called, in the wake of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and increasing global tensions exacerbated by the situation in the Middle East. My name is Jacki Davis. I have the privilege once again of moderating this afternoon's conversation, totally interactive conversation. I'll be asking our panel some questions, but if you want to join in the conversation, you can do so. Your microphones are muted, but if you want to ask a question, you can either click on the raised hands button and I will ask you to unmute yourself when the time comes, or you can use the Q&A button, not the chat, please, the Q&A, and write your question or comment. My only plea is that you are as brief as possible so I can see at a glance what your question is and who it is for. Last housekeeping before I introduce our speakers. Social media hashtag, if you wish to share what you are hearing this afternoon, is hashtag Democracy Reform Conversations. So this afternoon, our conversation is going to focus on paving the way for EU reform and enlargement. We're going to discuss why we need to reform the EU at this critical juncture in our history and in that world of escalating tensions and conflict. How ambitious do we need to be if we are truly to make the EU more effective, more democratic and ready for enlargement? And where do we go from here? I'm delighted to welcome our special guest this afternoon, Tiago Antunes, who is Portuguese Secretary of State for European Affairs. Thank you so much, Secretary of State, for being with us this afternoon. And welcome back to two regular contributors to Democracy Reform Conversations, Dominik Hierlemann, Senior Advisor at the Bertelsmann Foundation, and Corina Stratulat, Associate Director and Head of the European Politics and Institutions Programme at the European Policy Centre. So let us get straight underway. Secretary of State, if I could come to you first. I mean, we see these growing calls for EU reform in order to confront the challenges we face. But nevertheless, we seem to be, the EU institutions, member states seem very divided on what the process should be for agreeing them and just how ambitious we should be. In general terms, before we drill into where we need to reform, how ambitious do you believe we need to be and why?
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure. Yes, we do need reform, and I'm very happy that now it is settled and understood by everyone that we need to tackle this issue of internal reforms. Even regardless of enlargement, there are ways in which the European Union works nowadays that already demand reform. But when we consider taking further steps in terms of enlarging the European Union, then it becomes even more clear that if today it's already difficult to take some decisions at 27, it will be much harder to make decisions at 30-something member states with the current set of rules. And the impact on major policies and on the budget will also be major. So we really need to address these issues because we want to enlarge. And so, yes, we should be bold and ambitious because we want to enlarge. Not for some time, many people were trying to avoid this debate because these are difficult issues, difficult to agree on. But I'm very happy that now everyone realizes that we need to address this, that this is high on the agenda, because this is a step in the way to enlargement. This is not creating problems to enlargement, rather on the contrary, it's creating the conditions, the absorption capacity that will allow us to take on board new member states. That's why we need to face the issue of reform.
So yeah, so indeed, just to follow up on that before I come to Dominik and Corina, that growing, as you say, an agreement that we need to reform, but when it comes then to how bold, how ambitious, a lot less agreement. The minute you start to get beyond the headline of we need to do something, what is your sense now of how ambitious the member states as a whole want to be, or where we can go with this?
Well, obviously there are different views. We now know that we have to reform. We don't have an agreement yet on how we should reform and how far we should go in this reform process. but we should take it, as we always do in European Union, step by step. And so it's already a major step that we've taken to realize that we need to reform at the same time as we enlarge. So the fact that the two processes now go in parallel, in lockstep, and they should advance hand in hand, this is already a major achievement. Now we need to focus on a timetable and a roadmap for both enlargement and reforms. And then we have to delve into the issues. And that's obviously more complicated. On that, we don't have an agreement yet. We more or less know the areas that we need to reform. So the scope of reform, we can talk about that. But how to do it, obviously there are still different views, but we need to start having this debate. It's only if we start discussing this in different fora, such as this one, that we will get somewhere. We're not there facing viewing a solution yet, but we know we have a problem, we need a roadmap, and we need to start discussing the issues to find common ground.
Thank you very much. And Dominik, putting this in the context of our focus in democracy reform conversations, particularly in the EU's democratic legitimacy and its capacity to act, how ambitious do you believe we need to be?
Well, I mean, I would agree with the State Secretary. So there is some sort of ambition, yeah, but I would say it's some sort of ambition. I mean, it's not that I see in every member state big appetite for reform at this stage. And I believe if you want to engage in a reform and then even reform the EU, and you start without any ambition at all, then the whole endeavor is doomed for failure right from the outset. So high level of ambition is important for the whole reform exercise to be successful. And we'd even go further and say it's not just ambition, we really need determination. And that is still something that I'm missing, even, of course, if we have some sort of political consensus and also a decision by the Council, of course. So that is good. But if we want to build the Europe, not just for today, but for tomorrow, we need a bit more. Now, as Tiago and Antunes said, so we're doing it in the European Union step by step, and appetite comes with the eating. But so far, I see still some kind of angst, not just on the German side, but on a lot of member countries' side. But it is important, of course. It is important from an international perspective. It is important that the EU sends a signal to Putin and to other autocrats of the world that the EU is capable of doing reform, that it is capable to act, and that we're facing actually, well, the new world and the geopolitical challenges we live in.
Thank you very much. Corina, complete the picture for us in terms of the level of ambition.
Thank you, Jacki, and good afternoon, everyone. Look, I think that it depends. It depends on whether one underestimates or not the challenge, or whether one overestimates or not themselves in front of that challenge. I mean, for example, you cannot really throw stones at a tsunami and hope to be effective in your response or in that process. But if you don't think that you're facing a tsunami, or if you think that somehow your stones are magical, then clearly your perspective will influence the type of response you're adopting. What I personally believe is that it's illusory to think that incremental linear reactions and modeling through, like we've seen the EU do so far in reaction to these past decades of many crises, that it will suffice in dealing also with the underlying causes and multiple consequences of the past crisis, as well as with the magnitude of the powerful forces that are still gathering steam in the age of the perma crisis that we live in. So I think both previous as well as new crises have repeatedly revealed that we have structural weaknesses in our models, in our systems, and also they demonstrated that these systemic problems will not simply go away. They won't just disappear because emergency policy intervention has provided some temporary relief. In fact, there is a real risk that things will only get worse and worse. So I think reforms should be ambitious because they need to match, or they need to be proportional to the gravity of the situation, to the scope of the massive interrelated, climate, digital, economic, security, demographic, democratic, and so on challenges that we face.
And is your sense, Secretary of State, that it's that gravity of the situation, it's the scale of those challenges that is really driving this growing consensus that we do need to reform? And we'll come in a moment to the scope and the discussions around that. But is that what is driving it above all else? Or, and of course they're associated, but the imperative of enlargement, is that more of the driving force, do you think?
Well, I would say the driving force has been the imperative of enlargement. So, as you know, for many years, the enlargement process was more or less stalled. And now we have a new momentum, a new impetus for enlargement. And as soon as this became a reality, then immediately people started reflecting on the impact that the enlargement will have. And in certain areas, the impact will be huge, will be massive. And that's why we need reform. That's why the whole chapter of reform then became this big issue as well, because people realize that we need to enlarge, we want to enlarge. There's a moral imperative and a geopolitical interest of the European Union to enlarge. And in order to do so, we also need to reform. We already needed some reforms, even regardless of enlargement. But it's the fact that we want to enlarge that has driven also the reform debate. I just wanted to add a note on the level of ambition, because when we discuss the level of ambition, usually the topic of treaty reform or treaty change arises.
I was going to come to that.
Oh, yeah, I imagine. and there, of course, everything becomes more difficult, because everybody knows how painful and traumatic even some of the attempts to reform the treaties have been in the past. And we can imagine that in the current political landscape, it will be as difficult or even more difficult to amend the treaties or to review the treaties. And so I would say two things on this. First, we should not start the discussion on amending the treaties. We should start the discussion on what do we need to change and what governance model do we want for the future of the European Union? And we need to first agree on that. And then later on, we'll check if that requires changing the treaties or not. And because if we start from the outset saying, let's open a convention to change the treaties as the European Parliament is calling for, it's a recipe for disaster.
On the other hand, there are people who say, sorry to interrupt, but there are people who say, if we rule that out, if we don't address it up front, then you're ruling it, or in some people's eyes, we won't get very far. We won't be very ambitious because half of the member states are ruling it out. So there are those who argue, well, we need to clearly state that it is on the table as a possibility. Would you not, do you think that's tactically, apart from anything else, the wrong way to go round?
I'm not saying rule it out from the outset. I'm saying do not put it as the first thing to do. So first, let's discuss content. Let's focus on content, not on procedure, not on formalities, if we need to amend the treaties or not. Let's discuss what's the model we want for the future of the European Union with more member states. And then we'll check if that requires treaty change. If it requires treaty change, if it can be done through the accession treaties, or through a supplementary treaty, or if it really requires amending the current treaties. But let's do that at the end, once we agree on a model. Because if we have already agreed on what model of governance we want, it will be easier to reform the treaties. But if we start a convention now, an open convention to amend the treaties without knowing what kind of changes we want, we won't get anywhere. So that's my first point. And my second point is explore all the possibilities that exist within the framework of the current treaties. And there are a number of possibilities for flexibility, for change, pastoral clauses, enhanced cooperations, etc. And so we should start there, doing what we can in the context of the current treaties, and only later on consider the issue of treaty change. If we frame it like that from the beginning, we will get nowhere.
Thank you very much. Corina, your reaction to that, and then Dominik, I'll bring in, but Corina first.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that if we start from discussions about treaty reform, I mean, it's quite self-defeating. It's not the proper place to begin reflecting about what has to change and what we want to do. I think the real focus should be why are we engaging in this process? What are we trying to achieve? And then we need to find the ways to get to realize our vision and to get to our destination. So I would agree with the State Secretary that it's not about the how, but it is about the what and why we want to realize. And of course, if then getting there entails treaty change, then so be it. I think we should go for it. I think that should not scare us. I think we need to come around and wrap our heads around the need that things will have to change. And we should muster the courage to do whatever is necessary to change in line with what is required of us in order to get where we want to be. And then, even on a more philosophical note, because this whole treaty change discussion and fear of change is always coming up, and I'm always puzzled, because how is it that, we change iPhones every year, we change, we update our computers regularly, we change at least physically throughout our lives because we age, seasons change. Yeah. So how is it that change is so omnipresent in our life experiences, and yet somehow we seem to believe that our institutions, our system of governance, our rules of European cooperation are somehow perpetually valid and somehow above all this constant change that happens around us?
You're in a very philosophical mood this Friday afternoon. But as the Secretary of State was saying, that focus on what is the governance model we want is where we start. Dominik, you wanted to come in as well.
Yeah, so it's Friday afternoon and we're approaching the weekend. So let's have a bit of a debate, because I agree with the State Secretary. Yes, there is always also, I mean, within our circles, people that seem to be more in love with the idea of treaty change than with the idea of reform itself. I agree here. On the other hand, so what I see is some sort of trepidation to approach the topic as such, and if we say, well, we go down the road and we have discussions between the member states, we keep it in the political arena within the political elite, and then we see at some stage whether treaty change is necessary, whether we do a convention at all, that doesn't seem to be very convincing to me. And if I look at an ordinary citizen, I ask myself, what should they think about such a process? Yeah, so it is still a very kind of Brussels process. Yeah, so it is not part of a public debate. And I believe very strongly that we need to bring in citizens very early in the process, that we need to build up public pressure, that we need to link it to a visionary debate, what the institutional setting of the EU should be. And in a way, the EU has some sort of advantage, because on the national level, of course, there is always some kind of institutional inertia. Yeah, people stick to the system they have. I mean, in Europe, we know that the system can change, so it can change. But Orban was very successful in building up fear and building up angst of national debates about Europe. I mean, let's not be that afraid of referenda. I mean, if we exclude referenda, if we exclude conventions at all, then the EU will not be capable of reform the next 100 years. So
we will come back on that issue a little bit later on, but I want first to focus, if I might, on, you said, State Secretary, at the beginning, first let's talk about what we want to do. Let's talk about where we want to go and what that requires. And Corina put it in a nutshell. Let's not talk about the how, let's talk about the what and why. So can we focus for a moment on the what? You said earlier, we know more or less the scope, the areas. And I'm intrigued by that, because, I mean, when you see the European Parliament's report on this, where they talked about areas where the EU needed increased powers, they were talking about health, environment, civil protection, indeed talking about exclusive competences for the EU. They were focusing obviously on their own role and so on. But in terms of the reforms we need to make, where would you put the focus, and where, going back to your point about, you know, the scope and the discussion about the scope. How do you see that at the moment?
Yeah, I was mentioning the kind of reforms we need in order to be able to enlarge.
Yeah.
And from that lens, in that regard, I believe there is more or less a consensus on 3 areas that need to be looked at. One is key European policies like cohesion policy and common agriculture policy. They will be severely impacted by the accession of new member states, particularly member states whose income level is very low. The impact on how cohesion policy works at the moment and how agriculture funds and access to agriculture markets exist will be major. So this is an area, policies, big major EU policies. Then obviously connected to this, the budget, because I keep saying enlargement. We want enlargement. We need to have enlargement. It's in our interest to enlarge, but it will have a price tag. It will not be cost-free. And it's good to have this notion right from the outset that we will need to be able to find the ways, the means, the resources to pay for the cost of enlargement, because there will be a cost. There will be benefits, of course, to all of us, to the new member states, but also to the current member states, but there will be a financial cost. So the next budget or the next MFF, the multi-financial framework, when we discuss that, we already need to consider the impact of enlargement and how we will address those costs. And thirdly, there are the institutional issues, the unanimity requirements versus qualified majority voting in the council. The number of commissioners in the commission. Is it feasible to have a commission of 30-something commissioners? The apportionment of seats in the European Parliament. Should we go beyond the number of 751 MEPs? Or if not, how do we redistribute those 751? And so these are some issues in terms of institutional, how the institutions are formed and how they decide, how the decision-making procedures that we need also to consider, because on the one hand, if we consider the Balkans, there are several small member states, which means that when it has an impact mostly on the veto power. If on decisions that are taken by unanimity, we are multiplying the possibilities of vetoes. If we consider Ukraine, it's just one country, but it's huge. It has once it enters, it will be the 5th largest. So its weight in the voting in the Council, in the European Parliament, etc., will be huge. So all of this will have an impact, and so those are the institutional issues that we need to tackle.
Corina, in terms of the enlargement-driven issues as distinct from the geopolitical-driven issues, because Tiago very much putting the emphasis there on those things we can sort of agree where we need to go because we know what sort of impacts we need to address.
Yes, I just wanted to add a 4th category to this list, and that concerns security and security issues, because all of this, or most of the, or many of the enlargement countries, certainly all of the trio countries, but also countries in the Balkans, have unresolved bilateral issues or border issues, statehood issues. They, you know, Ukraine and Russia's presence, so and relationship with the trio poses important security questions for the EU, and also, of course, we don't know what an end to the war would mean or not for Ukraine's territory, and also for our interaction with Russia afterwards. So the security dimension of things is very important, and this also puts a lot of pressure on the EU's internal security and defense capacities. So I think that's a 4th category of important changes or reforms that needs to be considered to the way we do things in the EU at the moment.
Thank you. Very much interesting that you framed that within the enlargement discussion, not just within the Ukraine discussion, the Middle East discussion, but very much part and parcel of both.
Yeah, but well, you can't, the EU is already, you know, in its discourse towards the Balkans, for example, it's adamant that it cannot bring in countries that have unresolved statehood issues or border issues with neighbors. So,
Yeah.
and it has proven a topic that has blocked the accession of the Western Balkan countries, some of them for many years. So I think we cannot ignore it. It is part of the conversation if we're thinking of an enlarged EU.
Thank you. Dominik.
Yeah, as we are already collecting topics and areas of reform, I want to add another one, which I think is really important and the basis for everything. And this is the topic of democracy as such. Of course, it is covered by institutions, but I mean, especially rule of law, of course. And this has to be part of the debate. And of course, so if we really want to change that area, we're also talking about treaty change. Certainly, I agree with the topics that were mentioned. I mean, it is about distribution of power and distribution of money. So these are the two things we're mainly talking about. But if I may add a dash of German into that conversation, you know, we've got Zeitenwende and Schuldenbremse. So Zeitenwende is the changing times, of course, due to Ukraine, and then Schuldenbremse is the debt break. So, I mean, we're doing that sort of reform, and money is scarce, yeah? So, and that is, of course, the challenge for enlargement as such. But that also, of course, hampers all the debates about institutional reform. But back again to my first topic, I think having also a debate about, I mean, what Europe is and what holds us together as 30 plus countries is important, because if not, we're always ending in that kind of, I don't know, Copenhagen dilemma, you know, member states join and then they do whatever they want when it comes to the rule of law.
Yeah. State Secretary, I want to come on to another area as well, which is coming up in the questions from our audience about differentiation. But before I do that, your reaction to Corina there adding security and Dominik adding democracy, most particularly the ever vexatious issue of rule of law.
I agree. I agree actually with the two additions. So I would say that the three more obvious areas and the ones where there is a larger consensus that need to be reformed are the ones that I mentioned. But of course, also security issues are very important, considering the conflicts, the border disputes, the breakaway regions that we have in several of the aspiring member states, and of course, rule of law, because we are very demanding and very rigorous when it comes to the rule of law in relation to the candidate countries, and it should be like that. But then we need to be aware that the rule of law, it's not just a condition of accession, it's a permanent requirement of membership. And so we need to improve our mechanisms. We have been doing so. We have been evolving in the way we try to enforce the rule of law. Not everything is perfect. There is room for improvement, clearly, but we have been adding new tools. So the toolbox is not stable. It has been evolving, but still, of course, there is room to consider some improvement in order to make sure that the rule of law is permanently observed and complied with.
Thank you. I'm going to come to differentiation in a moment, but Corina wanted to jump in.
Yes, just to have a sentence on the rule of law, but not only for the aspiring countries, also for existing member states.
Yeah.
But just a small parenthesis. And then the one thing that I wanted to react to is this discussion about costs of enlargement. And I think what we need to do is also consider the costs of non-enlargement, and to also adjust our understanding of what costs mean, because cost is not only financial cost. You know, I mean, think of a situation in which Romania and Bulgaria and some of the other Eastern European countries now would not be part of the European Union. I mean, we have a lot to gain from solidifying, consolidating the club that goes beyond financial means. And I think the cost of non-enlargement has to be factored into the consideration and the conversation.
Coming to this issue of differentiation, and of course, the Franco-German expert group report did look into this issue and did say we need to accommodate diverse preferences for over 30 member states, but put limits on it in terms of the conditions and going back to the rule of law, core values, no There, you cannot have differentiation. But we've got a couple of questions from our audience. One from Paulo Rocha Trindade saying, would the creation of the European political community, as proposed by President Macron, is it a solution towards enlargement and could help to answer this question of different speeds for different member states? Francois Roux says a 30-plus member states EU will be a very different animal. Enlarging and reforming the EU simultaneously will require a different framework. The sad story, as Francois sees it, of the European political community proves this will be difficult. Any ideas for a larger, less integrated EU? This whole issue of differentiation, State Secretary, how do you see it, and how do you see that debate evolving?
Yes, I think we need to face differentiation when we consider the prospects for a future EU with 30-plus member states, because we'll have more member states, more different member states, and diverse member states, and member states with different aspirations and expectations in relation to the European Union. Some want to integrate further, want to be more integrated. Others are just comfortable with what they have now. And others, you can see that are already no longer probably comfortable with the level of integration there is and would like to take a step back. So you have different situations. And if you put in more member states, you'll have even more. So I believe we'll need some more degree of flexibility. We already have considerable flexibility in the European Union with the Eurozone, with Schengen area, with several enhanced cooperations. So differentiation is not something new. It's something we've dealt with for many years. But as we grow larger, I believe we'll need to face the fact that there will not be a one-size-fits-all model. We will need to consider differentiated solutions, flexible solutions. On the way to the European Union, so this is the so-called external differentiation, or as you can, the other way to say it is gradual integration or sectoral integration. So even before the formal and definite moment of accession, these candidate countries, you should phase them into some of our policies. But then also within the European Union, once all member states are in the European Union, you need more, we believe in Portugal that we need to face more flexible and differentiated solutions. I don't think the European political community has proven a solution to that end. It's more a forum for a political exchange, which is important in itself. But it's not a differentiated solution as such. Now, when we speak about differentiation, then there are different proposals, different models that have been voiced. You have the idea of concentric circles. You have several ideas. I think we should avoid a model in which it seems there is a first class and a second class, or a first tier and the center and the core. That won't fly, because nobody obviously will want to be in the second class. So what Portugal has been proposing is an idea of a European Union in the future as a multi-purpose building. That means that it is based on common foundations, which are basically the rule of law, the European values, democracy, that obviously is unquestionable and is binding to everyone. Then there is a common area shared by all, the common market and other policies. And then there are different rooms, which are different policies, in which each member state gets to decide whether they want to be in to participate or not. So it's not about creating a kind of a waiting room or a second tier to leave some member states in an outer periphery. It's about everyone getting to decide the level of integration they want and how they feel comfortable with being in the European Union, sharing more powers or less, participating in more policies or less, and so being more integrated or less.
Thank you, Dominik. And can I just link this to your comments earlier about bringing citizens into this conversation? Because if you start to talk about the sort of thing that Tiago is describing there, that needs to be the subject of a public debate, doesn't it? Really, about how countries see themselves and the degree to which individual countries, where they see themselves in this more differentiated pattern.
Yeah. I mean, all of that needs to be part of a public debate. It's very important. I mean, we can't do any reform without having a public debate on it. And look, the discussion on differentiated integration, I mean, it is nearly as old as the EU itself. So, and I'm not sure, so I hesitate to say that this is very appealing to citizens and also to candidate countries. And when we look, I mean, we hear that very often, you know, a lot of things can be done with a passerelle. So why are we not seeing it that often? A lot of things can be done with enhanced cooperation. Yes, we've got Schengen. Yes, I mean, we've got Eurozone, not within enhanced cooperation, but Eurozone. But then when you look at the other areas of enhanced cooperation, you're talking about the European Public Prosecutor, so that is fine. But then things like the divorce law, patents, property regimes of international couples, stuff like that. It's tiny stuff. We do not have those big projects in enhanced cooperation. So it's actually not that easy to do it at all. And I would really urge the political class, all of us, to enter an open debate about the future of the EU, the vision we have, incorporate citizens in that debate, and to make sure that citizens have a chance to bring in their input, but also then to drive the debate forward. If you want to avoid citizens to have them in the debate, then you will lose at the end of the day anyway, and you will
I'll
not
come
get
back to you on that point and how you see their role a little later. But Corina, to this discussion about differentiation and how to do it and whether there is a better idea, if we all agree the European political community is not the solution, it's more of a, yes, a useful forum, yes, a place to talk, but it hasn't provided, it's not going to provide that vehicle for differentiation. Do we need another body like that? Did we create the wrong sort of body, or how do you see this?
Yes, and it should be mentioned that the European political community was never intended to address the enlargement problem. And we've heard it over and over again from officials and from the fathers and mothers of the initiative that it was not meant as an alternative to enlargement policy. It was sold as an initiative in the context of the new geopolitical reality, and no, certainly everybody wanted to avoid the risk that in enlargement countries would fear the European political community. So that needs to be put there, that any associations between the between EPOC and enlargement are ours now, but are not official. With regards to differentiation, I agree mostly with what has been said in terms of the fact that it is a reality. It's something that has been happening in the EU, so it's nothing new in a sense. But I am strongly against the possibility that we consider now at this point, especially if I think of the Balkan countries that have been in this process for 20 years and that have been actually promised full membership, not some sort of second-class membership, or, you know, now Europe a la carte where they can sign in into some policies but not all, or where they can have some rights but not all. At this point in time, I think it would be a blow to the credibility of the European Union. And also, I don't actually see how it can function sustainably for the long term. I think it can be an option as you bring those many countries in, because of course they have different sizes, they have different, they're at different level of preparedness. So yes, it could be an option as we try to achieve enlargement, you know, in steps or in stages, as some proposals have suggested. But I wouldn't see it as a model for the EU permanently. It will be a temporary solution, if anything. And even then, I think it needs to come with guarantees that these countries will not find themselves relegated to the peripheric circles, or that, you know, we don't end up in a situation. And also, it might not work, because think of how interrelated policy areas are nowadays. I mean, even the common market and economics has been so much linked to sanctions and to foreign policy. How can you disintegrate these policies in the new reality?
But so, and making that point there, really, that when the Secretary of State was talking about first in class, second member states, and we can't have that, I think we tend to focus on the member states we've got and further integration, not thinking about in the enlargement process, and would that result in people joining, if you like, a lesser tier? So it's in both ways. A provocative question from our audience: wouldn't the proposal for a two-speed Europe, we're talking more not speeds, multi-differentiated Europe, be an admission of failure and an abandonment of the European federalist objective? So, says the anonymous questioner, should this model of differentiation be accompanied by an easing of the procedures for leaving the EU? As you'll tell from my accent, the country I know best, I find that a painful question. And also from John Palmer, links this to the issue of Donald Trump moving potentially back into the White House. John saying he has made it clear he has no enthusiasm for the European Union and has hinted at a US partial or total withdrawal from NATO. Does this not make foreign security the overriding priority as it begins the next phase of integration and enlargement? Maybe the common foreign security policy, says John, will be a positive force for a closer EU. We touched on that question of security. I wanted to throw that into the mix. But I wanted to come back just for a moment on the link between the conversation the EU is having about getting ready for enlargement and the enlargement process itself. And State Secretary, you said they will go in parallel. They are in lockstep, and we need timetables and roadmaps. But that's a tricky process, because the enlargement negotiations are driven by the progress of the country applying and so on. And they have a concern that the EU might hold up the process if it can't agree on internal reforms. And the EU will have a concern that countries need to be ready. So irrespective of when they agree. So in terms of that alignment, how important is it that they go in lockstep, or do you see potential issues there? And what does all that mean for our strategic agenda for the next 5 years?
It means that we need to start working fast, so that we're ready when the candidate countries are ready. The Granada Declaration, the Granada Summit last October, said it clearly. Both future member states and the EU need to be ready at the time of accession. So I understand the fear by the candidate countries that all this talk about reform, because it's so difficult, in the end, it might postpone, or it might lead to the European Union saying it's not ready when the candidate countries are ready. So, but we need to avoid this. So we need to do our homework. We are we're always saying to the candidate countries, do these reforms and do that and comply with the criteria. So we need to say the same to ourselves and take it seriously, because if we want to be serious about the decisions we have been taken in granting candidate status, in opening up negotiations, then we need to do our part as well. So this is not, as I've said before, this is not something aimed at creating stumbling blocks or difficulties or pushing the accession further down the road. This is something that, because in order to be able to have new member states to be ready for that, we really need to reform, and we should start it right away and take it very seriously, and it should be a priority for this next European term. Of course, security issues will also be a major priority. Security and defense, that's clear to everyone by now in our geopolitical context that we're living. But we will have to be able to deal with both, with the geopolitical and security and defense concerns, and stepping up our game in terms of defense, and also in reforming to be able to be ready when the candidate countries are also ready to come on board.
So that being the key, Corina, you have to do it in a way where we are ready whenever they are. So it is aligned in that sense, but it's not aligned in the sense of going, oh, we can wait because there's been a bit of a hiatus or a hiccup in the negotiations, or there's areas where they're not ready. I think the State Secretary is saying, no, we must be ready, we must plough ahead and let that process then take its course. Would you agree with that?
I would go even further and say that if the EU was to move on with its internal reforms and with the changes that it needs to undertake in order to prepare itself for a union of 30 plus, I think if the EU started to take those steps, no matter in which order and how quickly. I think it would give a strong signal to the enlargement countries that the EU is serious about enlargement. I think it could motivate those countries to undertake the difficult reforms that they need, the costly reforms that they need to carry out in order to accede. So I think this could help enlargement, in fact, and it could help the credibility of the policy, a credibility that has been severely bruised over the past years. So I think there's more than one reason for why these two processes are linked. They're linked. They're two sides of the same coin, as we like to say at the EPC. It's because, of course, it is an imperative for the EU if it wants to grow that big, but it can also be a motivating factor, can have a pressure function for the enlargement countries themselves. So they can be mutually reinforcing and beneficial.
Okay, we don't have that long, so I want to come to another issue, if I might, Dominik. And you talked earlier about, you said we need ambition and we need determination, and that led you into the conversation about the citizens being brought into the process and so on. And I'm wondering, in terms of, we haven't mentioned the outcome of the Conference of the Future of Europe and where it pointed us to in terms of areas for reform, going back to that conversation, but how you see potentially citizens contributing to this reform discussion. And do you think it could, when we get to the point where intense negotiations are going on about how ambitious to be, that they could provide a push, if you like, to overcome some of the roadblocks that member states might put in the way? How do you see their role and how it might play in?
I know I'm a bit repetitive on that, you know, so it is true, but the thing is, I just do not see it happening. You know, everyone is talking about citizens' involvement, citizens' engagement, but very often, I mean, we're paying lip service to that. And I mean, of course, so it is enlargement that drives the debate on EU reform. But I mean, even if it just was the single success of the Conference on the Future of Europe, we can say it was also a result of the Conference on the Future of Europe that it was brought back on the table. And citizens played a decisive part, I would even say, in the Conference on the Future of Europe. They voiced their concerns, of course, about the current status of the EU, about the way the EU works, and they came also up with a lot of recommendations. But they also made it very clear that they want a strong EU, that they want to see institutional reform, that they want to see more citizens' involvement, and and that rule of law and the democratic foundations of the EU are key. So now the question is, how do you bring them in? And it is not that I have the silver bullet. And together with the EPC, we put a lot of ideas on the table. So big tent for then institutionalization of citizens' assemblies. You can do it in various ways. But so far, of course, the Commission is pushing ahead with the institutionalization of citizens' assemblies, for example, but there is no joint effort of all three institutions. This is something I'm missing. So if we want to bring in citizens into the debate, so there are various options. I believe it is important to bring them in early, to create links between citizens. It is also possible to bring them into the enlargement debate and to do some sort of participatory enlargement, because that was also a failure, I would say, of the last big enlargement waves, that we didn't build enough links between civil society organizations of various countries, between citizens, but also between politicians, of course. And here, new formats of engagement and participation could also help. So to put a long answer short, so the methodology is there, the procedures are there, but we need the political will to bring them in early, and then they will help. Citizens will help to give it a push, the debate, and to get it going.
And I'm wondering, linking that to what the State Secretary said earlier about when he was talking about the three key areas and the policies that will be impacted by enlargement, the budget implications of enlargement, whether explaining, yes, the costs, you said it doesn't come cost-free, there are costs, but having that public debate and as Corina put it, the cost of not enlarging as well, whether that needs to be. But Corina, we're going to focus on this more in the next democracy reform conversation, but you have just published a paper, you co-authored an EPC paper called Participatory Democracy at the EU Level, How to Break the Invisible Ceiling, which was published last week. In a nutshell, why do you talk about an invisible ceiling, and how do you see it specifically, in, not broadly citizens' participation, but in this discussion we're having today about reform?
Well, I mean, it links very much to what Dominik has said. We have experience with this instrument. We experience both in terms of knowing how to do them, but also experience in understanding that they can work. Citizens are capable of dealing with complex issues. Citizens are capable of collectively putting their brains together to come up with creative solutions, and also they are capable of being ambitious and courageous in asking for change and for reforms. So we have that experience, it's there. But what we're missing, in what the paper essentially argues in very brief, is that there's still this invisible ceiling, which is basically the institutions that Dominik touched upon, resisting change, and especially member states. There's a lot of the political will, and the political will to imagine how the system can work differently, the political will to accept that there is space for citizens to input, the political will to admit that, well, perhaps certain changes will have to incur to their prerogatives and to their level of influence, but it's for the bigger and better good. All of that is missing and is blocking the possibility for
the European Parliament report on EU reform does talk about strengthening the citizens' voice, and the European Parliament traditionally was very much in the territory of we're the elected MEPs, historically not that in favour of it. State Secretary, we don't have long. I don't know whether you want to comment on that at all before. Yeah, please.
No, I just wanted to say that we have a huge challenge here, because of course we have to bring the citizens into this discussion. We cannot keep on discussing how to reform the European Union, and particularly we cannot take decisions on the back of the citizens and keeping them at bay. And so we'll have to involve them somehow, but it's quite challenging to see exactly how we do that, because for certain issues, of course, the citizens, they have a voice and they have an opinion and they can voice it. But for other areas, for the more institutional matters, it's not some. I was part of the Conference on the Future of Europe. I was a member representing Portugal. It was very interesting. And the citizens, they wanted to discuss policies. They didn't want to discuss the nitty-gritties of the power of the European Commission and the power and the competencies of the European Parliament. That's not something they are interested in discussing. They want certain things for their lives. They want the European Union to be more present in terms of health policy, in terms of, but they want to discuss what's impactful in their lives and not the nitty-gritty technical aspects of then the power struggle and the power grabs. And so there are certain areas of reform which are difficult. I mean, even today, when we talk about the European elections, it's difficult to attract people, and especially young people, to get interested in EU affairs, in to understand what's at stake and how it's important in their lives and go to vote. So to discuss the certain areas of reform, it's even more difficult. And then there's a risk that some will use this debate to scare the citizens against enlargement, to highlight the problems, the costs, the implications in terms of losing power or losing money. And so there's a risk that it will scare public opinion against enlargement. And so it's quite challenging how we frame this public discussion with the citizens on these issues. But I'm not saying we should do it. Of course, we must do it. We just need to try to figure out exactly how to do it. And I thank the EPC for bringing ideas and for coming forward with suggestions of fora, of ways in which we can bring the citizens into this discussion.
Indeed, and all this very much part of the work of the Democracy Reform Observatory, in which both Dominik and Corina play such a part. Just on that, before I want to ask you one final question, but just on that point about enlargement, the costs of or the costs not, Andre de Munter in our audience says the cost of integrating the Western Balkan Six would amount to approximately 0.6% of EU member states' GDP. This is peanuts, he says, in terms of the return on investment when it comes to security. And he talks about the Western Balkans and Moldova being Putin's next target. Not a day goes by without multiple further moves in that direction. I just wanted to throw that into the mix, but we are almost out of time. It's Friday afternoon. I don't want to keep anyone from their weekend. But let me ask, I want to go back to a quote that I have used often in these democracy reform conversations. And it's something that the former European Parliament President David Sassoli, sadly no longer with us, said at the launch of the Conference of the Future of Europe, when he said, democracy has not gone out of fashion, but it must update itself in order to keep improving people's lives. State Secretary, you talked about the European elections, about getting people to come out to vote. How important, linking this to the debate on reform and the debate on enlargement, how important do you believe it is for European democracy, for getting the public to engage, to vote, to deliberate in whatever form we do, that we get the answers to these questions right?
Yeah, so just very briefly on the costs, I'm absolutely sure that the cost benefit analysis is positive in relation to the enlargement, but there will be a cost side to it, and we need to discuss how to finance that cost.
Absolutely.
But the cost benefit will be positive for both for the candidate countries and for the European Union for sure. Yes, it is what for the citizens, I believe what is important is that the European Union delivers. And we are seeing that today in some areas, or in order to take some decisions, it's already difficult for the European Union to take decisions. So when we bring more countries in, it will be more difficult. So we need to address this. The capacity to act is a major, a key aspect in order for the European Union to continue to fulfill and satisfy the citizens' needs. So yes, in order to respond to what the citizens are asking, we need to do this reform in order to preserve the capacity to deliver of the European Union. Otherwise, we'll get stuck more and more often, and we won't be able to respond to the citizens' needs.
Thank you very much. Dominik?
Oh, again, me. So I thought the final words is up to Tiago. So we shouldn't get stuck. Yeah. So that is really key. I think, of course, I agree. So the EU has to deliver. So this is important. I would still say so, going back to the earlier question, citizens, that is my experience, are also interested, perhaps not in institutional discussions, but in discussions about democracy as such. I mean, democracy will not be the same in 100 years from now. So the EU has to change as well and has to adapt its institutional setting to the new challenges. So having that debate with citizens, I believe, is important, and it will be helpful for the EU. And this is a change of mindset. So that I would still love to see on a European level.
Corina?
Yeah, I would also add that actually all these experiments we've had over the past years, and not only at the EU level, but also at the national level, actually show that citizens are capable of tackling all sorts of issues, institutional or not. Yes, sometimes they have a bit more difficulty with understanding institutional issues at the European Union level because of how complex the institutional setting is. And of course, there is a lack of awareness, but I assess more positively their involvement with institutional affairs in the conference, in the context of the COFOE. And also, I would say that we've constantly in the past brought up this issue of risks that, well, there's going to be these people who are going to hijack the topic and the conference and, you know, inject their radical populist extreme views into it. And this has never proven correct. So, and I would say a fearful mind is a rigid mind, and a rigid mind will snap when there's pressure. So I think we shouldn't be fearful. I think we should continue down this path of improving democracy, of increasing citizens' participation. And I would say it's not just a question of relevance, it's a question of survival for the EU.
But also that crucial question of if this whole debate about enhancing the capacity of the EU to act, as Tiago said, if we don't deliver for citizens, the debate becomes meaningless. We go back to the what and the why rather than focusing on the how. Thank you so much for a great, lively, energetic. It's great to see you with so much fuel in the tank this late on a Friday afternoon. We had a great audience, lots of people attending, particularly Tiago. Thank you so much to you for joining us this afternoon. It was great to have you with us and get your thoughts. And I'm glad that you are optimistic that we're at least on the right track in terms of the conversation between the member states on what we need to do, even if there's a long way to go yet. So thank you, Corina, thank you, Dominik, but most of all, thank you to all of you for joining us, and have a lovely weekend. Bye-bye.